Oh, wow. When did I first fall in love with theater and musicals? I think I was aware of performing as a child. I was bullied a lot as a kid, and I realized if I could make people laugh, then they wouldn't hit me. So Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny cartoons were my favorite shows as a kid, and so I would do an imitation of Pepe Le Pew. I remember this one girl she was very shy, and sometimes she would tease me, and so I would go into a Pepe Le Pew routine and grab her arm and start kissing up her arm, and she'd turn 10 shades of red and run away. So and just launch into just weird little imitations. It was my comedy was my go-to, or trying to make people laugh. I don't think I can call myself a comedian by any stretch of the imagination, and I fell in love with it when in school, when I discovered I could write. The teachers would have me stand up in front of the class and read stories to people, and I could feel the whole room lean forward. And I remember at one point mentioning something that was in the back of the room under a cupboard, and the whole class turned to see as if they were expecting it to be there. And I thought, wow, this is really trippy that people, it's like kind of this mass hypnosis. It was just this sense of power, I guess. That was, it was liberating. Why are musicals important to me? That's a really good question. I guess it was a way of me discovering other possibilities. I was really shy as a kid, and it's funny, I was always told that I couldn't sing growing up, but I loved to sing, and I loved musicals. I loved those old MGM musicals, and I was teased a lot because of my race growing up. We grew up in Coronado, San Diego, so I faced racism from the white kids there. Then moving to Virginia, my dad was in the military. I faced racism or discrimination, I should say, from black kids because of the way I spoke and because I had white friends. My nickname in Virginia was the white girl, I guess because I spoke properly or wasn't, really wasn't aware of how I was supposed to sound. What is black supposed to sound like anyway? And I would see these shows and wonder, what's that like? That's such a world that's so big and expressive and wonderful, and it was a way of just taking me out of myself, I guess. And it was also a way of expressing all this bottled up emotion. I mean, there were things that I couldn't express, and the emotional intensity behind someone suddenly bursting into song was just really fascinating and disturbing and so enjoyable. And I always wondered, how can I do that? And it wasn't until much later when I started performing, and I would show up at auditions and people would say, well, go ahead and sing a gospel tune because, you're black, you grew up in the church. And I'm thinking, no, I did not. And so I figured if I wanted to work in theater, I better figure out how to do that. The first show, one of the earlier shows I started in high school, it was a black musical version of The Princess and the Pea called The Princess and the Black-Eyed Pea. And I wrote it because I didn't see any black princesses at the time. I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, and the whole idea of the fairest of them all, even this cultural construct of what beauty is supposed to look like, what royalty is supposed to look like. I mean, everything was this Eurocentric point of view. Everything was filtered through that. So even though I was born in Africa, my father was in the Navy, and I was born on a military base in Kenitra. So there was this kind of exoticism, when I would come into a community and people would say, oh, you're born in Africa, that must mean something. I didn't know what it meant because I had no connection to that history. It wasn't taught in schools. My dad was very determined to make sure that I, that I knew African American writers. So he was always pushing a book in my hand, and my head was always in a book. I was mostly reading science fiction and fantasy, so he was always trying to get black authors into my hand, and he did that. So I wrote this show, I thought of this idea, well, what if it was a black princess in an African kingdom? What would that look like? So I started writing it in high school and never really finished it until years later. I did this thing called a vision quest ceremony, where you go out into the woods and you bang on a drum and you fast and pray and ask for a vision, and then these characters started coming up, and I just started writing it, and I submitted it to the Lemon Musical Theater Workshop and forgot about it. And then about a week later, or 2 weeks later, after I mail it off, I get a call from a man named John Sparks, and he said, I just read your first kind of treatment of this play. He says, I think it's wonderful. He says, I want to be your personal mentor on it. And, I looked at the program, but you had to pay, money. And at the time, I didn't really have a lot of money to pay for this training program. And so he took me under his wing and personally mentored. We had readings at his space that was over on Hollywood Boulevard. And I would have readings in my living room and at friends' houses. And eventually, I submitted it for something called at the time called the Jonathan Larson Awards. First it was the, what was it called? It was, not John Larson. Stephen Sondheim and John Guare are on the board, American Academy of Arts and Letters. So I submitted it for that, and I won. I won a $25,000 grant, and they invited us out to New York to do a production of it at the John Houseman Theater. We got a Moss Musical Theater, had all this Broadway talent involved with it: Carol Weiss, LaShawns, Rodney Hicks, who was in Rent, Ken Page had done it at some incarnation. So it was just a lot of attention. So we did the reading there in New York, and we did it in the small black box space, and I guess word was getting out about this show, and it got to the point that there were so many people calling for tickets that they had to move it up to the John Houseman Theater, which was the bigger space, and it was selling out. And it got to the point, I guess, people were calling Ticketrons thinking it was on Broadway, and it wasn't. So from there, it was kind of this heady whirlwind thing. I got this letter from Stephen Sondheim, saying, come out to, congratulations, you won this thing. And it was really exciting, and we were being schmoozed by a lot of people, and it was too much too soon. In hindsight, it did end up having a production at the San Diego Rep. It was a really horrible experience because of my own fear and my own inability to say no and to believe in my own work. So that was a huge lesson for me, and kind of a godsend in a way, to learn to value my voice. So I hope that wasn't too circuitous of an answer. But I wrote that piece out of an impulse to see myself represented. We need to get more voices in the theater because our lives are changing. And there are dynamic artists in every community. Our theater has been institutionalized. And it's a hard thing because, they do want these voices, but at the same time, most of the people who can afford theater or who have the time for it, are retirees, older, mostly white, upper, middle, upper class, who have the financial means. So we need to find more ways of not only just inviting, the community out when they have black musicals, or do a show about the Latin experience or the Asian experience, or LGBT plus experiences, so it's got to happen not only on the stage but off the stage, and we need to find ways of just going into communities, and because we need to train up the next generation, because if you're not invited in, I still go to plays and I'm the only black person in the audience. If I go to see Shakespeare, maybe I might count other people just on one hand. And thank God that there are people still supporting these experiences, but unless you see yourself on the stage or on film or on screen in some capacity, then your brain doesn't begin to make the connections like, oh, that's a possibility. Oh, my story is valid. Oh, I have something to offer our culture as a whole, because it's also the opportunity to consider other possibilities and other ways of being that we may not have considered. So, what is it like to adapt a classical work like Antony and Cleopatra? It is overwhelming. I love classical work. I was introduced to it at a young age in high school. I had a wonderful drama teacher that would take us to Shakespeare festivals. When I was 14, 15, the Old Globe Theater was having a summer youth training program to teach kids Shakespeare, and we were going to do a show at the Marquis Theater in San Diego. And Eric Christmas was an actor at the Globe Theater. He was a British actor who was a darling of the theater at the time, and his partner Marcy Maddox, who was the speech and vocal coach who also later became my teacher at college. So I'd always been intimidated by it, but there was something about the way that Eric explained it or introduced us or taught us how to analyze the language, and it was like a door being opened. You just heard this click, and then suddenly this whole world and the richness of the language and the poetry and the relationships and it was so visual to me, and I loved it. I asked my parents for a complete works of Shakespeare for my 15th birthday, and so I would go to the bathroom, and I remember reading Richard III and the scene where he's seducing the woman, the queen whose husband he just killed, and I just thought, this is madness. But I just loved it. I fell in love with the writing and with the stories. So that I had on my side. Adapting it was overwhelming. It was, because it's, people feel they have such ownership over that material. And so I had this voice in my head, who do I think I am? Who am I to try to impose my story on this great classic literature? I'm like, he belongs to everybody. He's not, Shakespeare is not, or whoever wrote it, is not exclusive to any one person. And why isn't my experience just as valid as the bard's imagined experiences? So I had to be fearless in that and have the audacity. But it kept coming to me as music. And to me, it's rhythm, it's meter, it's music. And I think musical people attempt it. Why not? And I think you trust your own artistry to reveal something else. So that's been the process for me, is divorcing myself from this sacrosanct idea of how holy these stories are, because I find that there are enough points of connection to where I found my own poetic voice in that. I like to do a lot of research. Because I like to get the worlds right. I think specificity and wanting to really care and be invested in the protagonist. And I was working at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival at the time, and a dear aunt of mine had just passed away. And complications from diabetes, but what I didn't know was that she was addicted to crack cocaine. And it was devastating. And I remember sitting in my apartment after having received the news, and at the time I was reading Antony and Cleopatra, having a glass of wine, and my neighbor, an actor in the festival, Derek Whedon, had turned me on to Mary J. Blige's What's the 411. So I just sat down and I put that on in the background, and I'm thinking about my aunt, and I read kind of one of the opening lines. If it be love indeed, tell me how much. There must needs be a new heaven and new earth. I'm badly paraphrasing, you might know. And I just stopped and I thought, wow, these people are really messed up. This is a really dysfunctional, codependent relationship. And I'm reading and give me Mandraga to sleep away the time my Antonio was gone. I mean, these are two people completely obsessed with each other. They're, and they're these really powerful people. They're world leaders. They really command power, and yet here they are, and they can't figure out how to love each other. One of the most basic human needs. Why do they need each other so much? So I was also reading the San Jose Mercury News, had this big expose about the Iran-Contra controversy that was not conspiracy, but thing that was going on, and Oliver North was testifying, and just all these things about, is it really true that the American government could possibly be selling these drugs to buy arms, to pay for an army, to protect their interests? Meanwhile, in order to raise a lot of money, they give all of this cocaine to these street dealers and these Ricky Freeway, the guy who masterminded figured out how to cut the cocaine and distribute it like the McDonald's of drugs, and just basically infest our communities. So I started to see these connections in whatever altered state that I was in, and grieving my aunt. And I thought, there are a lot of connections here that are very similar to me, and I'm thinking, I had this crazy idea, what if? So I met with the gadfly, the resident dramaturg at the Shakespeare Festival, Barry Kraft, and I had a number of powwow sessions with him that would last whole weekends. We'd go and pick blueberries and drink champagne, and he said, it's interesting that you found the connection with drugs, because in Antony and Cleopatra there are more references to mind-altering substances in this play than in any play in the canon. So that was my, I guess, permission. I thought, okay, I have got a point of entry now to this play, so let's see what that is. So that was in 1995, 1996. So you could say my process is fairly long, because there are a lot of big ideas. And I've actually had some interest. I submitted it to the Public Theater years ago, back in the early 2000s. And one of the dramaturgs there named Michael Cohen, responded to my email. I just submitted him like the first 20 pages or something. And he said, this is really fascinating. He says, I'm really intrigued by your idea. He says, I've never seen anything like it. If you're ever in New York, let's have a meeting. So I happened to be coming to New York later that fall, and he got me tickets to Bloody Andrew Jackson, and I got off the plane and went to the show, and then the next day we met up in Times Square, and he said, because I had sent him the whole script by then, he goes, this is astonishing, and I really love this piece. He said, the only reason I'm not passing it on is because no one knows if hip-hop will work in theater, will work on Broadway, because I wrote it as an urban opera. So it's not just hip-hop, it's hip-hop, it's spoken word, it's R&B, it's Latin music, it's trance music. I wanted there to be a particular musical sound. So fast forward now, Hamilton obviously proved that it does work on Broadway. And there was also another show called Venice at the time that they were trying to get moving, and nothing ever materialized with that. So I guess they figured this musical form doesn't work. But it is an American art form, and musicals began as an initial way, was the popular music of the time. So I don't know why people are still writing musicals in the styles of the 1940s and 30s. It's like, okay, I appreciate the history of it, and it's part of our heritage. Can we move on? Because there's so many exciting musical forms, and there are people from all over the world that are part of this American experience, and I want to hear those stories. And if I'm not hearing them, I'm going to just step out and have the audacity to say, let me try it then. Well, I decided to focus on the love relationship of Antony and Cleopatra, who I call Antonio. And Cleopatra is a recording artist. She's a music mogul, and she's made her fortune as a musician and as her own business person. I was looking for iconic images of formidable modern Black women, and I was kind of hard pressed. I was looking around for political figures, short of some, African countries, but I wanted something that was more relatable to our culture. And, our royalty are our athletes and our entertainers. Hopefully that's changing now as we see, this last election, more women and people of color. They're changing what that is supposed to look like. But it works for this story. Antonio is a mercenary soldier for CEO Caesar. The country is now run by a corporation. The country has failed. Our great government American experiment isn't doing well, so in comes CEO Caesar, who runs a pharmaceutical and a number of tech companies, and he's changed the face of the country. So he's basically saved the country, and Antonio is a war hero. He's saved us in the last great war. So he's a general who's past his prime, who is still waiting for his citizenship to be granted by Caesar, because, they've clamped down on who can be a true citizen. Also, as they did in Rome, I kind of took a little artistic liberty because I wanted to set it in another time, a dystopian, not so distant future perhaps, but Caesar has decided to reset the clock. So it's now ANRY1, which means after New Rome, year 1. So it can really be in any time and place. So I really needed to reset it just to recreate this world. So it's focusing on these two. Antonio is also very married. Antonio just did another drug run for Caesar, because it's the same conceit as the Iran-Contra, is that Caesar is buying weapons to protect the factories that manufacture this drug called Flow, which is basically enlightenment in a pill. That it's the only sanctioned pharmaceutical in New Rome, and it's supposed to better our endurance and better our cognitive thinking, to make us all better citizens and better able to participate in the society. So that's where the show is set, and it's interspersing it's how do these very public people learn how to coexist and love and trust each other and try to make a better life. Antonio is still working for this dictatorship, this regime, and Cleopatra is seeing, the folly in that and the fallacy. So they're on either side of the argument, and it's how do they come together and can they come together. Allan is the other half of the musical soul of the show. We met in college. I approached him about singing in this band that I was in called Sweeney Todd. And we were being produced by this guy who he had just come off of Yoko Ono's Dogtown. And I was working with this guy named Todd Vincent Cohen. And so we were in this band for a little while. Nothing ever happened with our album, but we stayed in touch over the years. He's a really prolific musician. He's from Venezuela. His father was a musician, so he grew up basically playing percussion as his first instrument, but he's classically trained. When I met him in college, he was working on his degree there. He's an ethnomusicologist. He can play any style. And when I was looking for a composer, my biggest influence musically was Jesus Christ Superstar. I saw that when I was maybe 10 or something, and it just unraveled my brain. But I love it feels still timeless to me because it's classically based. There's a classical foundation. I keep thinking of that opening refrain from that song, and so I knew that I wanted someone who had a classical foundation but could play anything, and that's Allan. And so I called him, and I went down to the studio. I had a bunch of lyrics, and so he sits down at the piano. He goes, "Okay, how does the song go?" I sang, "What do you mean, how does it go?" He goes, "Just sing." So I was like, I don't know what to sing, and I had a friend in the studio, and he said, "Carol, just put one note in front of the other." And so I started singing, and then Allan started composing, and I think in that session we wrote 6 songs. And I've never worked that fast with a composer. It was usually, we'll work with this song, maybe that'll take us a week or so, or a couple of days. But 6 songs in like one session was crazy to me. So I thought, okay, we're gonna do this. And it's been kind of effortless working with him, just because maybe because we'd worked together before and we've known each other for so long, but I think that's just a testament to his talent and his intuitiveness and his insight and his empathy. And but he also understands theater, he understands dramatic structure, and you don't always find that in composers. You find, especially with modern pop musicals, you're like, you'll get a good pop song, but it has to advance the story. I decided to use different musical styles because in my research of the play, the characters speak differently. When you're in Egypt, it feels more conversational. It's more free verse. When you are in Rome with the Roman characters, it's like code switching that we do. Everything is in meter, in time. It's there's a formality, there's a structure to it, which, in Shakespeare's time, was reflective of the Romans really valuing intellect and being dispassionate. And there's in all the supporting characters, there's also a different tone. At the end, Cleopatra adapts that formal way of speaking. So I wanted that reflected in helping to delineate the characters. So when we're in Club Osiris, which is Cleopatra's realm, it's more spoken word poetry, R&B, hip hop. When we are in New Rome Inc., I wanted more techno music, to reflect the technology and the formality of this corporate structure. So you think kind of sterile halls and this whitewashed walls and that sort of thing. And when we go to Venice Beach and you're with Cleopatra's backup dancers, the original characters are Charmaine and Iris. I'm naming them Charmaine and Iris. And then there's Alex, who's a DJ. So they have a different way of talking, and so theirs is more pop and much more colorful and more fun and fun-spirited to bring a lightness to it. So I wanted to integrate these different musical styles to reflect the different communities that we're in. And then Antonio, has Latin, is Latin culture, so I wanted to bring in some of that music but I also wanted it to be specific of West Coast and California. This is Mexico basically. So that informs our culture. And if I'm looking at also a future reimagining, how do all of these growing cultures, how might that color the world that we're living in? I think we're going to have more of that influence on our culture. So all of this goes into the mix of creating the sound of the piece. As more of them overlap, there's more musical integration as the play progresses, because these, you can't keep these worlds completely segregated for long. And I thought that was interesting and an interesting challenge. Which characters have a certain musical motif? Joey Molina I met years ago in San Diego. He's an extraordinary singer. He sings with the opera there. He's a crazy high rock tenor. And he's also now a producer. He produced a film called Ruda Madre with Paul Rodriguez, and he just sold it, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So that's very exciting. We met on this crazy musical called Celebration of the Lizard, which was all Jim Morrison's poetry and the Doors music. And we did our initial reading with Grace Jones and Billy Zane, and it was crazy. And we did a production of the show in San Diego years ago, so we've stayed friends since then. And he's played Antonio for me in every incarnation of this, and sang on the demo when I initially had the idea of this crazy idea. And he's been aboard and supportive and even pushing me when, I thought, what am I doing? What am I doing trying to translate Shakespeare? I'm out of my element. But he keeps pushing me and encouraging me. I think I'm not interested in answers. The message for me was, how do we begin to address all the underlying problems that we as a society have? And I don't think there's any one message. I think we all do what we can. I think the tragedy for me in reading Antony and Cleopatra in Shakespeare's show was these two people who really couldn't trust themselves enough to really love each other. And if they did, how might it have been different? I think that, to me, is the huge tragedy. And they were up against something that was so formidable. I mean, we're talking about a world power that just wanted domination, complete domination, and they were both also incredibly ambitious and political people, but they still had something that transcended that. They still had something that continued to bring them together. So the impetus for writing it was the grief that I was dealing with of an aunt, one of the only relatives that I knew that helped, that basically was around as my brother and I were growing up. How do we address corruption when we see it? How do we address cultural differences and our own biases? And, when those get in the way of a bigger problem, which is our survival, which is, how does your country survive something that is seemingly insurmountable? How do we get over these biases and mistrusts that we have of each other and say, we have this common good, that we have all this potential to step into if we learn how to really know each other and to know ourselves and to trust each other. So I think that's, especially within the climate that we're in now, I guess that was really why I wanted to lean into this story and put it out there. So what I would like for the audience to get out of Rule My World, everyone's going to come with their own expectations, but for me, I think one of the hardest things that we have as a culture is leading into uncomfortable conversations, whether it's about religion, whether it's about politics, whether it's about sexual orientation, immigration, war, whatever issues. I think we need to start finding a way of engaging things that are uncomfortable for us. I think this it's not polite to talk about these things. I think it's really crucial. Drugs is still a huge problem in our culture. We're a drug nation. Pharmaceuticals is huge. Medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, for however you feel about that, is part of our life now. What does that mean? What is that going to mean? Opioid addiction. Right now, it's not necessarily crack cocaine. Cocaine is still big. Crack, I'm sure, is somewhere, but it's, what is the opioid? Heroin is really plaguing places in our community. Why? Why is that still a problem? What are we missing culturally in the way that we support and look out for each other? So we're challenged by a lot of things. And I think sometimes we feel overwhelmed by what we can do. Just do what you can do. We can't, each of us as individuals can't solve them all, but we can do something. Whatever you're called to do. If you're called to write about it, write about it. If you're called to volunteer at a shelter, do that. If you're called to take in a family or sponsor them, if you're called to, give to a certain foundation that you believe in, give. I don't think but collectively, all of us at least doing something, having a conversation, I think that's the biggest thing, but changing our culture around the way that we have conversations with each other about things that are hard for us, that hurt us, and that are difficult, so we can learn something. The Southern California community needs to come see this show. I think we need more opportunities to come together, to have these experiences, things that reflect our stories, things that will help us. I'm always going to theater looking for another what if possibilities, and I think it's one of the few venues where you can get together with other human beings in a room, have an experience that's moving, that's powerful, and it's not entertaining. It's a way of engaging some of the things that we're dealing with, and I'm really wanting to be a part of a community and to participate in a community and to know my community and knowing how I can serve and be a part of that and use what little gifts and whatever opportunity that I can. I think it's a timeless story. It's a love story. You're going to hear some extraordinary singing, see some wonderful performances and see this story in a way that you hadn't imagined it before. And I think it's going to be accessible to people who might be put off even by musical theater, because it ain't your mama's musical theater. It ain't your grandmama's or grandfather's. No offense to all the ancestors and the grandparents out there, but it's me just also wanting to move forward and to be a part of this art form. So please come support. It's going to be an extraordinary. You don't want to miss Joey and the rest of the extraordinary cast.